Thanks again, everyone, for joining us for our GoAERO expert lecture with John Everlove today. It's my pleasure to introduce Gwen Leiter, CEO and founder of GoAERO.
Thank you, Nidhi. Hello, everybody. And we are so pleased to have you join us for this expert lecture. As you all know, GoAERO is a competition where we bring the best teams together throughout the entire world. And our mission is focused on saving lives. We are supported by a number of different partners, including Boeing, NASA, RTX, and a multitude of different organizations as well, including AIAA and AUVSI. For those of you who will be at EAA, Oshkosh, we look forward to seeing you. We will have a booth in the Boeing Pavilion there. And then the following week, we will be at AIAA Aviation in Las Vegas as well, and look forward to seeing as many of you as are in attendance. So today, we are so very pleased to welcome someone with about 35 years of experience in emergency response. John Everlove is the person municipalities call when there is danger and disaster. He is truly an expert in emergency services. John Everlove holds a master's degree in emergency services administration and emergency management, and he currently serves as a battalion chief overseeing emergency medical services operations, implementation of EMS equipment and resources, as well as primary and ongoing EMS education and training. He's a nationally licensed paramedic and a chief officer with leadership experience in aviation rescue operations. Clearly, we'll be speaking about that. Ambulance transportation and pre-hospital EMS regulations, policies, and procedures. He holds several state licenses as a paramedic, along with specialized training. He has been everywhere and anywhere where disaster strikes. He knows what he is talking about. He has been on the front lines for several decades, and we are so pleased to be able to welcome John Everlove to join us today. So thank you, John. Turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. Honored to be here. A privilege to be able to speak to all of you today. My goal today is to share some of the information that I have regarding the foundational care that we provide in the pre-hospital setting. And I've prepared a presentation for all of us to go through. Obviously interested in any questions that you may have, and making sure that we get as much information as we can out of this presentation. So thank you for participating. I'm going to discuss emergency medical services really from the time that someone calls 911 and what they're looking for, what their needs may be, to the moment that we deliver them to definitive care. And we'll talk about what the difference is between those two. In pre-hospital care, we have several different agencies that routinely participate in emergency medical services. Some of them are fire department based. Some of them are private ambulance based or private transportation systems. Some of them are government based systems or organizations. And some of them are nonprofit groups that participate in the delivery of pre-hospital care. You can see in these pictures that depending on what region you're in and what the needs are of your community, EMS care can be provided routinely using motorcycles or what we call quick response vehicles like this truck utility bed. And really, depending on the needs of the community and the types of equipment that we're able to carry, we will use different vehicles to respond to different calls for service. Traditionally, however, for our critical patients and our patients that need the most extreme care, if you will, or exist in the extreme life-threatening or critical stages of their condition, we use this similar type of platform of a ground resource, which in this picture is a fire engine, and a ground transportation resource, an ambulance with staff and equipment to treat a patient in their time of need. And then an air resource may be called in to transport a patient to a farther distance or to gain access to a patient who needs to be rescued from their current condition. These interactions and these agencies working cooperatively to get work together make up the network of emergency medical services in the pre-hospital setting. The nature of the delivery of emergency services and emergency medical services has changed dramatically over the last few decades. It's a very unique subset of healthcare, and it deals with many of the challenges that we face on a day-to-day basis in an effort to mitigate the challenge, deliver the patient to appropriate care, and to provide some level of care during the transition. The level of care that we provide oftentimes is affected by community needs. So, how many members live in a certain community, population density, geographics and topographic limitations or challenges, socioeconomic barriers and access to healthcare is a priority for us, and we're working hard to bridge that gap so that people on one side of a street within a city receive the same healthcare as people on the other side of the street who may not be included in that city jurisdiction, but should still have a high expectation of service. There are limitations within the emergency medical services community, really focusing right now on trained personnel and the availability of resources. It is easy to purchase the vehicles, it is easy to deploy vehicles. It's very difficult to staff the vehicles and maintain a certain level of trained personnel. Also, emergency medical services has changed dramatically based on the needs of our communities over time, related to different medical situations, like, for instance, the pandemic, which dramatically changed the level of service that we provided, traumatic incidents that we see on a regular basis, or traumatic injuries, hazardous materials events, terrorist events, disaster events, tactical medicine, which is a new part of emergency medical services that includes the deployment of paramedics and EMTs into the pre-hospital settings where we face active shooters or those people that are trying to do harm in mass casualty events. Rescue environments in which people find themselves exploring areas that maybe they shouldn't, or find themselves in situations where they didn't anticipate being in for one reason or another and require a rescue component. And then the emergency medical services community has been called upon to deliver public health services. And so this picture, this gentleman to the right, he is operating out of an emergency vehicle that does not have transportation capabilities, but is traditionally used to provide palliative or supportive care for patients like hospice patients or tuberculosis patients, patients that wouldn't routinely be transported to the hospital, but have a need for pre-hospital care services. We face patients with different conditions. Patients either succumb to or have a medical event. This can include a cardiac event, a difficulty breathing event, or some other medical condition. And then we face patients who have traumatic events or suffer a traumatic injury secondary to an incident. Some of those patients are ambulatory and can walk back and forth to an ambulance or to an ambulance gurney or stretcher. Some can walk to the hospital or into the hospital on their own, under their own power. And then we face others that are unconscious and completely dependent upon the emergency medical care that we provide. Some are in mild distress and require very little intervention and may just require monitoring and observation and a transport to the hospital, while others have an immediate life-threatening condition that requires more invasive interventions or invasive care. But what we know through our education and training is that what happens to our injured or ill patients in the pre-hospital setting when they receive care directly impacts their outcome. And so, unlike taking Uber or some other taxi service to the hospital, the care that we provide in the pre-hospital setting does make the difference in patient outcomes, regardless of their level of distress or the interventions that we provide. Related to airborne platforms, currently in the EMS system, we have rotor wing and fixed wing platforms that we use on a regular basis for different circumstances or situations. Our current rotor wing platforms are the most popular and the ones that are utilized the most regularly. We have two different types of aircraft that we engage in. We have rescue aircraft and we have medical aircraft, and sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're different. Different aircraft are utilized for different types of patients and different types of scenarios. There are some limitations to aircraft usage. As you can see, both of them are expensive. Currently, many insurance providers within the United States do not recognize air transport systems in the insurance reimbursement schedules. And so a aircraft called for a rescue in a wilderness environment or called to the scene of an accident in which a patient is transported from the scene to a hospital via rotor wing delivery system, that patient will receive a cash bill where insurance may not cover any or even a portion of that bill. So both tend to be expensive resources. Both require a landing zone or some area that you can touch down. Both require high maintenance and an ongoing schedule of maintenance for the platform to be used regularly. That maintenance is inclusive of medical devices as well as aircraft systems regulated by the FAA and other oversight agencies. Some aircraft are side loading, like the Bell platform, the 412 that you see to the left, and some are rear loading, as you see to the picture on the right of a medical aircraft. And depending on the type of loading system, that affects the utility or the versatility of the resource. Both of them are challenged with the amount of space that you can actually provide care to patients in the back of the resource. Aircraft that are rotor wing tend to be very compact. They have a lot of medical equipment or rescue equipment and medical equipment, and therefore the care that you can provide to a patient can be limited. Many times, just the nature of flying in an aircraft limits the amount of care that you can provide. For example, listening to lung sounds is not feasible, or viable when it comes to evaluating a patient or assessing a patient. There are other limitations to the patient assessment, monitoring, and treatment while in an aircraft. And therefore, the aircraft becomes a very fast ambulance, but it doesn't necessarily make itself conducive to patient care depending on the nature of the patient condition. But when it comes to a rescue component, that's where the aircraft has primarily been the tool that we've used for operational need. There are fixed wing aircraft that are used routinely also for the transport of patients, excuse me. Limitations with these vehicles are that they're very expensive. They require an airport or an airstrip. There's a highly specialized level of education and training that goes with transporting patients by fixed wing aircraft. They're high maintenance, and as you can see from the picture on the right, there's still a limitation of space and availability to treat patients, and they're not used for primary 911 response. So they also need a ground transport unit to move a patient from the airport or airstrip to the awaiting hospital for care. So in these circumstances, like the previous slide regarding rotor wing aircraft are really used in the pre-hospital setting primarily for the transportation of critical care patients from one facility to another. In the areas or jurisdictions where they're being used for scene management or patient care on scene of a call, the rescue component becomes a significant tool for us and benefit to using rotor wing aircraft in responding to an initial incident and to make initial care and contact with a patient. Because the GoAERO project could include a transport or non-transport resource, there are several things to keep in mind when it comes to the equipment that we use in the pre-hospital setting. One, the weight of the equipment varies dramatically depending on the manufacturer and materials used for that equipment. For example, the gurney that you see to the right or ambulance stretcher that is routinely used in pre-hospital services has a power pack or a lithium ion pack system that powers the gurney. It's hydraulically based power system, allows the gurney to move up and down from a loading to an unloading position. And that system weighs approximately 70 pounds without a patient and without any additional equipment. Therefore, the non-transport vehicles may carry similar medical equipment as the transport resources, but the weight difference and the weight capacity of the platform will vary dramatically based on whether you'll be transporting patients or not transporting patients. Then we have the care provider, and the care provider estimated weight in American or the United States measuring system. Care providers are estimated to be between 171 to 177 pounds, although it can vary dramatically depending on the overall weight of the person who's going to be operating the vehicle or in the vehicle at the time of operation. And certainly that would be emblematic of the varying weights of our patients. One of the limitations within our transport vehicles right now, when it comes to rotor wing aircraft, is patient weight and size. It is possible to have a patient that meets the condition to go by air and not have the ability to transport the patient by air merely based on the limitations or gross weight limitations of the platform. In the pre-hospital setting, we encounter unique challenges and unique environments every day. The dynamics of the pre-hospital services system mean that we are always prepared for the unexpected, and whatever we know in this moment may change dramatically. It's a dynamic environment. Some of the challenges that we face include weather, the scene dynamics, the condition of the patient, and the nature of the call that may change. As you can see in these pictures, the one above is during Hurricane Katrina, in which rotor wing aircraft were used to rescue people off of the roofs of buildings. Notice the power lines and the other things that are what we call high risk factors in rotor wing aircraft rescues or operations. And then in the bottom picture, that is a picture taken of a local brush fire in which the air quality conditions and the conditions change dramatically, in which rotor wing aircraft can operate in one portion of the event, but not in another portion behind the smoke line. So it's something that we face and it, I think should be considerations for the development of a vehicle that's going to operate within these spaces. Regardless of the nature of the call for service, one thing we don't have the ability to do is to say no. And so our platforms need to be as versatile and based on a utilitarian development model that we can deploy them into as many different incidents as we can, and we can operate within many different spaces using the platform to be a solution for us, whether that's the delivery of supplies and resources, the movement of patients or caregivers, the delivery of supplies for patient care or for provider care, or the actual transportation of patients. We need a system that is going to operate within these multidimensional spaces to meet a multidimensional expectation of the emergency medical services community and the public that we serve. This is an actual photograph. There's a video that actually goes with this of a mountain rescue that was performed in the state of Oregon on Mount Hood, in which this National Guard helicopter pilot landed the rear of the helicopter on the mountain to load a fallen climber, and the aircraft was kept in that position, and a rescue was performed of all of the people that were involved. Given that we are dealing with the life of a patient, the lives of the public, and the lives of the crew members or EMS workers that we deal with on a regular basis, and having operated within these platforms within similar types of environments, we have zero room for error. In other words, the system that is developed must be reliable, must be dependable, and must be a system that is really predicated on risk management and safety to appropriately operate within these spaces. Obviously, this was a very unique rescue, and it is a unique example of the challenges that we face rather. However, I would argue that these are challenges that present every single day in different ways, and that we take these opportunities to show off our skills, if you will, but it's not necessarily unique of the skill level that we have to have every day. Oftentimes we discuss speed and the deployment of resources in a timely manner to change patient outcomes. And while that is true, and that there needs to be a timeliness to the service that we deliver, as I note here, rapid intervention only matters when the resource is reliable and can get to the scene and provide definitive patient care or transportation to definitive patient care. So, regardless of the challenges, if it's a platform that we can't use or rely on, then it doesn't meet our needs, even if that means going slower versus having a rapid deployment. So what exactly do we have within our vehicles that we use to provide care to our patients? Well, here's a list of some of the equipment that we use on a regular basis. Basic life support refers to just that, the more simple life support interventions that we provide to patients on a daily basis. The advanced life support refers more to paramedic level care or pre-hospital care providers that have advanced level training and therefore use advanced interventions. It should be noted, however, that many of the basic life support tools that we use are ones that have been clinically proven to provide definitive care and save lives to patients. So, as a platform is developed and we look at resources that we're going to bring to bear using these delivery systems or these platforms to integrate into emergency medical services, we should really be focusing on the basic life support supplies that I've listed here. They include, but are not limited to, spine boards or hard backboards that are used to move patients from one point to another. They're non-wheeled systems, so they're designed to be carried by at least two providers. Spinal motion restriction supplies that include collars that go around a patient's neck to stabilize the spine. Automated external defibrillators, which provide a shock to a patient who's in cardiac arrest and can allow the heart to restart on its own. Bandages, dressings, and tourniquets for bleeding control. These devices are critical in our traumatic events or our events involving multiple casualties. Epinephrine pens, which are the definitive care for patients who are suffering severe allergic reactions. Oxygen tanks and oxygen delivery systems. Oftentimes, these can be tanks of different sizes. They are made of aluminum. They have different weights, but with a little bit of oxygen for a certain period of time, we can see an increase in patient outcomes. Airway devices and ventilation devices that are listed here, which are considered non-invasive devices that can be placed by limited care providers. A stethoscope, blood pressure cuffs, and OB or childbirth supplies, which in and of themselves may seem out of place. However, oftentimes we find that we respond to calls with patients who are having a medical event or a traumatic event, and they happen to be pregnant, or they're involved in some other type of incident, and we have to provide care unexpectedly for infants or children, in which the supplies within these kits can help us in treating these patients. Advanced life support supplies include the BLS supplies listed above, but may also include a cardiac monitor instead of just an AED, IV fluids, IV medications, more advanced airways, and portable ventilators that breathe for a patient automatically without having a rescuer performing the physical task. All of these pieces of equipment, again, vary based on manufacturer, design, and the materials that are made. Our goal in emergency medical care is to provide primary life-saving care utilizing existing resources and then ensure transport of the patient to a definitive care facility. For trauma patients, the definitive care, the care that makes the difference in their outcomes, is surgical intervention, surgery at a trauma hospital. That means that the platform that we're currently looking at developing must have the capability of either extended resource deployment or extended transport of a patient, that payload, to a facility that may not be the closest facility. In other words, time on task, may vary depending on the needs of the patient or the type of patients that we encounter and the location that we encounter them in. If there's a rescue component, that rescue component could take a significant amount of time, hours on hours, before we can actually make contact and start treating the patient. Our medical patients also receive definitive care at certain facilities over others. For example, a patient having a cardiac event may need to go to a hospital geared towards cardiac care or require interventional radiology like the cath lab. Whereas our pediatric patients may need to go to a pediatric facility to receive the level of care they need. And what we have found clinically is that driving past the closest hospital to get to the closest appropriate hospital is actually beneficial and has greater impact on patient outcomes in a positive way. You'll see the picture on the right. That is a picture of a patient that's being ventilated using a bag valve mask by a care provider and who is also connected to a LifePak 15 cardiac monitor defibrillator. That device weighs approximately 18 to 20 pounds. And as we talk about weight, should be a consideration. In the development of a replacement platform, if you will, or a supplemental platform to our existing EMS resources, there are things that I believe are going to be important for all of the participants to pay attention to. Some of them I've outlined so far. Here are a few others that I would see as goals for development of a vehicle. One, regionally available for service deserts. And what we mean by that, and it's referred to in the GoAERO website, is that in the United States, we have numerous areas where there are limited resources, and the availability of resources varies dramatically depending on the community and the region that someone's living in. For example, the fire department services that we find in the United States, 78% of those fire department services are volunteer, and volunteer resources are dispatched to medical calls for service. Some of those volunteer agencies have transportation resources, others do not. In the areas where there is not a municipal or government-based transportation system, there are private entities that are under contract with municipalities, cities, or counties or jurisdictions that require that ambulance to be in service and to respond to calls for service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are areas within the United States that there are government-based services, meaning that the county or city jurisdiction provides the ambulance services with paramedics and emergency medical technicians, those basic and advanced life support providers, to provide care. However, in other systems, the hospitals actually have ambulance services affiliated with the hospitals in which they serve the community that the hospital is located. But because of these different platforms or different service levels, if you will, and the varying agencies that operate them or organizations and corporations that operate them, there's a disparity in service. And that disparity means that a patient with a cardiac event in one jurisdiction will receive dramatically different care than in another jurisdiction. And the level of care not only will be different, but will be reimbursed at different rates. Rapid deployment and on-station capabilities. We talked about rapid intervention earlier, and it's only beneficial if the platforms are reliable. If a vehicle is rapidly deployed and arrives on scene quickly, but cannot provide the service it needs to, then it hasn't met the expectations for an emergency medical services vehicle and one that we can rely on. And so the reliability of these vehicles is really important in making sure that they can arrive on station or on scene in a certain period of time and reliably provide the service it purports to provide, meaning that it arrives with whatever payload or equipment and provides the necessary support for the EMS agency personnel that are on scene with the patient. Rapid deployment doesn't have a time frame because it's different depending on what location you're in, whether there's a rescue component or not, ocean, And water rescues look differently versus mountain rescues. And so weather and different challenges can affect what is rapid or not rapid when it comes to deployment. Payload capabilities and equipment. I think this is one of the more significant portions of our conversation. There are currently unmanned aerial systems being utilized by law enforcement agencies to deliver AEDs to medical calls for service related to cardiac arrest events. Those patients that aren't breathing and don't have a pulse have the opportunity to deploy an AED to their location to treat patients in their time of need. So when it comes to payload, we're really talking about weight. And I know weight can be a barrier when it comes to rotor wing systems and to any aerial system. But those pieces of equipment are really going to dictate how I can utilize that tool when it comes to the care of patients and changing patient outcomes. Versatility and dependability. How versatile is the vehicle going to be to me? Can I use it for a broad range of call types? Meaning, can I deploy it and utilize it on 40 to 50% of my calls, 50 to 60% of my calls, 20% of my calls? Because of the varying nature of the call types and patients that we see that may or may not require some advanced level intervention, versatility is going to matter to me. What equipment you have and what tools I can use from that vehicle to treat patients in their time of need is going to be impactful. Dependability, how often can I rely on the device? How often can I rely on the piece of equipment? And how often can I rely on the vehicle? Really, those are the questions that we ask every single time we look at a piece of equipment or prospective tool that we're going to use in the pre-hospital setting. Safety driven. As I talked about earlier, we have zero room for error. Failures happen. Currently, there are a lot of rotor wing aircraft failures that we're seeing. Some of them are related to pilot error and human error. Some of them are related to equipment failures based on the high maintenance cost and the maintenance schedules associated with those vehicles. And some of them are related to manufacturer defects. Most of the failures in air transportation are related to crew error or pilot error. Weather conditions are something that they entered into that were unsafe and they took unnecessary chances. I can't give you a percentage. I can only talk about some of the more recent ones that I studied in which patients, crew members, members of the public were either severely injured or killed during the transportation or response process. And the next step is, of course, cost effectiveness. Is it going to be a point of service platform or is it going to be a fee for service platform based on transportation of the patient? If it's an equipment delivery system, then obviously it's not going to be transporting patients, but would there be an expectation that there could be a cost recovery process that could fuel the investment into this system for a community in a long-term basis or under a long-term conditions? For example, if it's going to cost a patient $50,000 every time they're transported to the hospital, then the community is not going to engage in a contract or want to see that vehicle used when it comes to point of care. If it's a point of service cost, subscription costs, or other types of reimbursement that models that are out there for using these types of systems, then that should be a consideration long term because that will factor into my decision making. Notice I put it on the slide as the last bullet point because I understand there's a lot of things that have to happen to get there. But certainly as we look at these projects and we look at implementation of the projects, then there's a cost effectiveness conversation that we will have at some point regarding the deployment or implementation of these vehicles within the pre-hospital system. As you can see from this picture, this is a mudslide event that we responded to. And I think what's really important to see in this picture is the amount of resources that were utilized in this response, but the amount of agencies that were utilized. One of the hallmarks in emergency services administration and emergency management is the networked group of providers, agencies, and stakeholders that complete the process of providing pre-hospital care and responding to emergency events. We don't look to one agency versus another. We look to multiple public, private, and nonprofit partnerships to create a network of services that we provide to the community. This is a wonderful opportunity through this project to engage in this networked system of providers as representative of the sponsors that are participating in this project, and representatives like myself who recognize that this is a collaborative effort, that there is not one solution to the problem. There are multiple solutions to the problem, because each incident or event is multi-layered, requires a multidisciplinary approach, is dynamic, and has to be responded to with the same thought process or management process, and that utilitarian view again of using available resources to meet the needs of patients and to change patient outcomes for the community. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for allowing me to share the information. I'd love to hear some questions and clarify any points.
John, thank you so much for such an informative presentation. As a reminder to all of our participants right now, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar to be able to pose any questions that you would like us to discuss today. We can start with one question perhaps is, does the typical EMS team have trailers for special situations? For example, a skiff or an RHIB boat?
Simply put, it is not typical for emergency medical services providers to have that equipment. We are starting to see with the UAV systems that are currently being marketed to the emergency services agencies, more of these platforms being deployed. It is usually a regional system, not an individual agency that will take on these projects unless they have the budget to engage in these activities, or if there are grant funds that are available to explore new solutions. However, what I recognize in the transition to a more technologically involved system is there's great value to those platforms, and that when utilized properly, I think they really expand our reach and the opportunity for us to provide services to some of those marginalized communities or outlying communities that we weren't able to reach before.
Thank you. Can you provide a ballpark for purchase and operating costs for a rotary wing aircraft?
Hmm. Yeah, the initial purchase varies dramatically. So it depends on the type of aircraft. The Eurocopter systems that have a lot of medical equipment and will respond to scene calls, perform rescues, and also provide transportation of patients from one facility to another. Those are tens of millions of dollars just to purchase the vehicle themselves.
Hmm.
The Bell 412 system and the other Sikorsky systems, again, tens of millions of dollars to get into the vehicle, unless you're able to get into them via government surplus. So what a lot of agencies will do is they'll partner with the federal government. When an aircraft times out in the military sector, they will rotate the airframe and that aircraft into the public sector, the municipal or state sectors, and they will rebuild the aircraft and then launch it as new. So some of the aircraft platforms that are out there are military aircraft that were used in the Vietnam era, that are still Vietnam War area in the 1970s, that have been rebuilt and repurposed for rescue aircraft. So the cost varies dramatically depending on the mission and the agency and what they're looking to accomplish. The A-Star systems or the Aerostar systems, again, can be tens of millions of dollars or in the $10 million range. The operational cost for each aircraft is slightly different. We estimated our Bell 412 systems would had an operational cost of approximately $1,500 an hour, and that was fuel, maintenance, and didn't include personnel. So the cost for personnel has changed dramatically and affects the operating cost of those vehicles. There are just some ballparks, but simply put, rotor wing aircraft are incredibly expensive. And as you get into some of the Augusta platforms, and some of the larger aircraft systems, it can be cost prohibitive for many agencies and many communities.
Thank you, John. Where do you sort of see, or what are the main risks associated with aeromedical transport in the urban environment?
It's a great question. Airspace is a significant risk within urban environments. A lot of vehicles operating within limited airspace. The public-private deployment of UAVs has created challenges. Although they can operate within a certain altitude, they tend to exceed those operational spaces, and so we have challenges there. Private aircraft or personally owned aircraft, everything from a small aircraft like a Cessna to the larger rotor wing aircraft that are used for transporting people back and forth, rotor wing aircraft like the Sikorsky programs with the retractable wheelbases that allow those vehicles to fly within urban spaces at higher speeds. Uh, Airspace becomes tight pretty quickly. Other challenges that we face are visibility issues. Depending on the location of the urban environment that we're flying in, there may be challenges with visibility due to weather, challenges with visibility topography and the way that the urban space is laid out or the density of that space. Those can create challenges. And then thirdly, landing zones. So as the aircrafts have become heavier, the existing helipads have not been retrofitted to accommodate larger aircraft. And so there are those locations or buildings that were primarily designed for aircrafts to land on them, but depending on the aircraft, you can't because it isn't rated sufficiently for the gross weight of the aircraft and the operational weight of the aircraft to be able to land in those environments. So there are some of the considerations that we have for urban space.
Oh, apologies. In your perspective, can you share a little bit more about what the future of EMS vehicles look like or should look like?
That's a great question. How they should look. That is open-ended, and I don't think I have an expectation in that regard. I do think, however, that we need to dynamically change the way we provide emergency medical services, given the broadened scope and expectation that has been placed upon us for what we do and what we can provide, and that we are going to have to develop alternatives to the traditional ground-based resources and their traditional rotor wing resources that are primary tools for delivery of pre-hospital care. And what I mean by that is that the ambulance systems themselves are antiquated. They provide for patient care in certain circumstances, but similar to helicopters, most of them are really just geared towards the transportation. And so I think what we're going to start seeing, and we need to start seeing, is more of a stabilization of patients in the pre-hospital setting and the transportation of stable patients versus the rapid transportation of unstable patients, which is a paradigm shift in the way that we look at pre-hospital care. An example of that would be cardiac arrest events. It used to be that we transported every cardiac arrest patient that we encountered within the pre-hospital setting. Now, transportation of patients in cardiac arrest and actively performing CPR on them during transport is a very rare occurrence because we've determined that their clinical outcomes are poor in those environments. So we're transporting less patients that require those immediate life-threatening interventions, really focusing more on stabilizing them prior to transport. I think that opens up the opportunity for patient transportation using using a GoAERO type of platform and still providing good patient outcomes.
Um, how many personnel, air crew, are needed for rotary wing craft, not including medical personnel?
So it depends on the platform and depends on the utilization of that platform. So a rescue helicopter, for example, would routinely have 4 to 5 personnel. One would be a pilot, one would be the flight officer in charge of communications, navigation systems, and location assessment upon arrival of the aircraft. Two other personnel in the back of the aircraft would be primarily responsible for the rescue component and some ancillary medical care or some more invasive medical care. In a medical transport helicopter, you can have as few as 3 personnel on that aircraft. A pilot who is solely responsible for flying the aircraft and operating the communication systems for that aircraft. And then the only other personnel would be the medical personnel, a nurse and a paramedic on that aircraft who would be responsible for patient care, and when not engaged in patient care activities could help support the operation or the mission with communications and navigation. But when there's a patient on board, that those functions are solely on the pilot. So you can have larger aircraft that require a larger group of personnel. And so it just really varies and depends on the nature of the aircraft system, what it's going to be utilized for, the location or region it's going to be utilized in, and the mission.
John, do you have a sense of the percentage of EMS incidents that would benefit from aerial access, at least surveillance and perhaps delivery and retrieval?
Yes, it's a great question. I I don't know that I can give you reliably a percentage. However, I can say reliably that if it's a versatile tool that offers all the things that you just described, it would have a much greater impact in utilization on calls for service, regardless of the nature of the call for service. There will always be a portion of the calls for service that require very few resources. In other words, patients that need simple interventions and transportation to the hospital. I think those calls for service require minimal resources for the projected future. However, there's a dramatic increase in calls for service that require a more enhanced platform than what we currently provide. And what I mean by that is the surveillance piece, the communication piece. I think is really important, and I think a vehicle that would allow us to use it as a repeated system or repeater system for radio transmission or digital communication transmission would be at the very least interesting. And I know there are some projects out there that are entering into that arena. Regarding the delivery of care and the delivery of supplies, those two things go hand in hand. Many times on our large scale events, we run out of supplies very quickly. And so having a payload that is deliverable to the scene of an incident in an unmanned aircraft that decreases the risk to a piloted aircraft is something that I'm very interested in. For example, our mass shooting events in the United States dramatically increased mass shooting events. We routinely run out of resources very, very quickly and run out of supplies very quickly on those events. And we've seen through after action review and reports that had we had more supplies, we could have saved more lives. So simply being able to deliver a payload is advantageous to us. The transport of patients, I think that's really the piece that we need to explore enthusiastically, and I think that's where the greatest opportunity is for the implementation of these systems.
What are your thoughts and opinions about using emergency technologies like eVTOLs for emergency response?
I love them. I think they're great. I think they really bridge the gap in our needs analysis for utilization of the resources and capabilities of the resources as an adjunct to what we're currently using. I personally believe, and I've spent a lot of time in these helicopter programs and utilize them in many different circles. I believe currently that we are overinvested in rotor wing aircraft solutions at a detriment to the ability to provide the service in a reliable way. And what I mean by that is that there are so many limitations on using rotor wing aircraft that they're very versatile when they can be used. They're dependable when they can be used in certain circumstances, but they can't be the solution to all of our problems. I think EVTOLs really start to fill that gap and fill that void in a meaningful way. If we can make them sustainable, dependable, and reliable, and we can make them cost effective, either through public-private partnership, grant funding, or investor personal investment or investment groups. I think we're going to provide more definitive care to the public on the whole, and I think that's going to be very, very meaningful. I also think that there's a global implementation strategy for these vehicles when it comes to pre-hospital care that will be meaningful because the events that we see in the United States are not unique to the United States. In other words, we see natural disasters, facilitated disaster events, multi-casual incidents throughout the United States and throughout the world. And when I traveled to Nepal after the 2015 earthquakes, I saw this firsthand that there were limitations to rotor wing aircraft use that would a gap in availability of resources that EVTOLs would have fit in nicely.
What do you think are some of the challenges that are taking place in the EMS world of incorporating this emerging technology into use, regulatory or otherwise?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. It's a highly regulated business, and regulations are challenging. In flight vehicles, regulations are tough through government oversight and through emergency medical services care. There are provisions and regulations that we have to abide by that exist at the national, state, and local level. Change is difficult. I think the greatest barrier right now is that many people in my industry have not embraced the technologies in a meaningful way. Many of the services that we provide to our community are based on tradition and based on expectation from the community that may be otherwise unfamiliar with these products or these systems as solutions. And so I spend a lot of time speaking on the technology and the value of the technology and the importance of embracing the technology for meeting future expectations and goals that are going to become more challenging with time. One of them is the unmanned systems and the limitations on existing personnel. As many people as we can get interested in our business, we do, but there has been a dramatic shift over the last 40 years in people that are not interested in serving their community and providing pre-hospital care. And I think this is where we really need to target the conversation as these being a solution to fit a need, and that the solutions seem far off, but they're available, they're tangible, and they're in real time something that we can use. I think getting past the reluctance, if you will, and the skepticism that I find in my business is one of the greatest challenges, and so I'm doing my best to be a better ambassador to that process.
It's interesting that you say that because now we have a question that is asking sort of the tendency of search and rescue personnel to adopt technology in a short time frame. Um, is there a tendency to do so? If not, then why is that the case?
There is, I think, again, just a general skepticism or reluctance to implement technology as a solution over and above the mechanics of what we have traditionally used. And what I mean by that is having worked for search and rescue programs and with search and rescue teams and spent a lot of time on these types of events, you trust the ropes that you can handle. You and feel in your hands something you can the mechanically control. If it's technology based, depending on the location, oftentimes there are limitations that made past technologies unsuccessful, creating further skepticism or doubt towards future technologies. In other words, confirmation bias. In other words, if it failed before, it'll fail again, and therefore I'm not going to even try. And I think that's part of the research and development and exploration phase that we're in, that many people in science embrace as part of the scientific method and part of the joy of research that creates skepticism and reluctance in the operational sectors where I'm looking at a patient that needs definitive action and operationally I have to be successful 100% of the time.
And we're coming upon our last question now. Do you find that resources are shared between EMS providers?
Simply put, no.
Mm.
No, rarely are they. There are a lot of reasons for that. Cost effectiveness is one. You know, one agency can afford a resource that another agency cannot, even though the agencies collectively see value in the resource. Another portion of it is political. Sometimes agencies will hold on to certain technologies out of political gain and benefit, and so eh, again, this is a traditionally based system that is really focused on success of individuals and departments and not collective successes. Where we participate regionally in activities where we share ideas, thoughts, and technologies is geared towards safety. And so if we can demonstrate a resource has a safety component that is verified and meets risk management expectations and can be a meaningful implementation or I'm sorry, meet meaningful implementation goals and operational need for tasks and objectives, then we share those and we're eager to come to unified solutions.
John, we have one last question that's just come in. If you can take
Okay,
just the
of
last few
course.
seconds to answer.
Yes.
Can you outline the importance of digital communications a little bit more? Is this to allow overwatch by experts in hospitals so the cares at the scene?
Yeah, so I emphasize the communication piece because one of the biggest failures that we have in every operation is communication. Either the availability of the communication devices or the availability of the communication resources and infrastructure. So something that we can concern ourselves with in disaster events is the prioritized communication we must have during an emergency event that allows exclusivity to the operators. And so anything that enhances communication is valuable. And so I simply throw it out there as being a component or piece of every operation that we have, large scale and small scale operations that would encourage communication among responders, communication among partner agencies, infrastructure that allows us to communicate with hospital systems and with regional partners are something that we focus on routinely.
Thank you so much, John, for such a meaningful and informative lecture. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to your continued participation with GoAERO over the next couple of years. Thank you to everyone who participated. As a reminder, the recording of the lecture will be posted at herox.com/GoAERO. And if you have not already completed your registration, please go ahead and do so that you can continue to engage with us, form your team, and build your flyer. We have another lecture coming next week, so we hope you will join us for that. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, John, so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.